So we are coming to the end of our series. We've been working our way through some of the parables of Jesus, and you say the end, what? There's more parables even in this 13th chapter of Matthew's gospel that we've been exploring. But, we've looked at parables all summer long. We'll leave some more for another time. We're going to turn a corner starting next Sunday with Kelly, who is going to be speaking because Sharon and I are on vacation starting tomorrow. And we won't be here next Sunday. But that doesn't mean that you can't be here next Sunday. In fact, I encourage you to be here next Sunday because Kelly has a really powerful message planned. And I'll be anxious to hear it on the recording at a later date. But you don't have to hear it on the recording. You can hear it live. Sharon and I are going to go away somewhere on the weekend. I'm here during the week. Sharon's going to work her day job during the week, and I have a long to-do list that I'm going to try to tackle. However, it's getting infiltrated with some other things, so I don't know how much I'll get done, but that's the hope. So we've been looking at the parables of Jesus. Jesus tells these parables, they're stories that have a point. And the point of telling these stories is to get us to learn something, to know how to live, and then to live that. And so you know as well as I do that when I tell you a principle, if I just tell you the principle of love one another, and I don't put it in the context of a story, it becomes hard to remember. But if I put it in the context of a story, you'll remember that story, and that story will prod you to love one another, or whatever it is, the principle that I'm wanting you to get. And I'm always amazed at how someone can hear somebody tell a story one time, and then they can go back and repeat that story, because that's the power of stories. That's why Jesus used this method to instill in us the message that he wants us to get, because they're more easily understood and remembered. So Jesus often in these parables uses common everyday things that most people would be somewhat familiar with, at least in his day and age, maybe not as much in our day and age, but surely in this parable that we're looking at today, he talks about wheat and weeds. And is there anybody here who doesn't know what a weed is? Now, I get it that you may not be able, if I took you to the garden, you may not be able to identify a weed from a green bean. I get that struggle all the time. I see it. But you know that a weed is something that you pretty much don't want to have growing in your flower beds or in your garden. It's not good. However, with that said, there are some weeds that grow, and I know Kelly was going to say this in the talkback time, so I'm going to just deal with it now. There are some weeds, some things that we call weeds that are edible, that are good for us. Dandelions, lamb's quarter, purslane, stinging nettle. It goes on and on and on. There's all kinds of things that we have identified and say now are weeds, but that God gave us intending them to serve some purpose in our lives. And there's an application there when we get to it that you can make about this. And so the parable goes like this. And the wheat. Everybody knows what wheat is. I mean, do you eat a sandwich ever? If you eat a sandwich, you probably eat some form of wheat. What's that? If you go without carbs, you'll starve? Yeah. A sandwich. Oh, okay. Pasta, yeah, there's another one. There's wheat. So wheat and weeds is this parable that Jesus is telling. And he says that a farmer goes out and plants wheat seeds in a field, and then an enemy comes and plants weeds. Now, we might find that a little bit interesting that an enemy would plant weeds, because in our culture, in our time, nobody comes in my garden and plants weeds, but there's an abundance of weeds. In fact, the grass weeds took over this year and embarrassed me by the look of my garden. I have these neighbors that always ride by, and in the spring they kept saying, they ride on a golf cart down the farm lane, and they kept saying, "Your garden's so beautiful." And then the other day they were riding by and looking at it, and they stopped, and I was like wanting to hide because I am embarrassed by the shape of my garden. But, gardens have weeds, and weeds aren't planted by enemies in our culture. If you have a flower bed, you probably have some weeds that are coming up in that flower bed, and you need to pull them from time to time. And so Jesus says this farmer plants the wheat in the field, and an enemy comes and plants weeds in the same field. And when the weeds are discovered, the workers on the farm come to the farmer and say, "Hey, we found there's weeds in the wheat field, and we'd like to pull them up. Is that okay?" And then in the parable, the farmer says, "No, don't pull up the weeds. Let them coexist with the wheat until it's time for harvest, and then we'll separate them. Because in pulling the weeds, you might destroy the wheat." And then Jesus explains this parable. He doesn't just tell it, he explains it. He doesn't explain all of them, but this is one that he explains. And in the explanation, Jesus says that the farmer who plants the seeds of wheat, the good seed, is Jesus. And the field is the world. The good seed are the people in God's kingdom. The weeds are the people who belong to the evil one. The enemy who planted the weeds is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the world. Now, there's several important things that we learn about God and his kingdom from this story, this simple story about a farmer who plants wheat seeds in a field and an enemy who comes and plants weeds, and an eager group of workers who want to pull the weeds out of the wheat, and the farmer who says no, not until harvest time. The first thing that we learn from this powerful story, and it should come as no surprise to any of us, and that is that good and evil exist in the world. Did anybody not know that there's evil and good in our world? I mean, all you have to do is turn on the TV or turn on the radio or open the newspaper or walk out down the street. I mean, it's everywhere. We see it every day. We can't escape the reality that there is good and evil in our world. And in fact, if we're honest with ourselves, we even participate in both good and evil. Now you say, no, I don't participate in evil. But when you get angry at someone, when you hurt someone, you're participating in evil in the world. And sometimes the sound of evil is so deafening that all we can do is focus on it. But for every evil act in the world, there is good. And it's up to us to look for and celebrate the good that we see in the world. When we live as agents of God's blessing, brothers and sisters, we bring good into the world. And that's the task of the church. That's the calling that we have. I think this parable speaks loudly and clearly to the church that it is not our role to bring evil, to bring judgment. It's our role to be agents of blessing. The second thing we learn about God and God's kingdom from this parable is that God doesn't cause the evil. Okay? The devil planted those seeds. The enemy planted those seeds. And the workers who ask who is responsible for sowing the seeds get the response that it's the enemy, the devil. While God doesn't sow evil in the world, he does allow it to exist, to coexist with the good in the world. And that may be the point that we struggle the hardest to understand. Why does God allow evil to exist in the world? Ever asked that question? I ask it all the time. And it's certainly a reality that we wish were different. In fact, most of us probably would wish that God would deal instantly with evil that's existing in the world, right? Be careful what you wish for. But God doesn't deal instantly with evil that happens and exists in our world, does he? And for good reason. Now, this is where the analogy in the parable breaks down for me, because weeds don't turn into wheat. But evil people can turn into good people. And thus the reason why God doesn't deal immediately with evil in our world. Because good can overcome evil. In the garden, in the Camden Community Garden, for instance, the evil that we have there is called wiregrass. Some fool went to Florida and thought wiregrass was beautiful. It's called Bermuda grass. And it stays green in Florida all winter long. But here, when they plant it, it turns brown and it grows and it's vicious and it spreads like wildfire. And like my neighbor next door put a $9,000 blacktop driveway in, brand new, took it down to the dirt and put new stones and packed them. And within a couple of months after putting that blacktop down, this wiregrass started coming up in spots in the middle of her driveway. It didn't come from the yard out. It came from deep down in and burrowed its way up through the blacktop. It's called, it's evil. It's devil. Yes, it is. And it can take over a whole garden bed. It can take over a whole yard. It can take over all kinds of things, and nothing really kills it. You can stun it by spraying it. We tried burning it in the garden with an expensive weed burner that I bought. And in about 3 weeks, it's back as beautiful as it was, or ugly as it was before we burned it. And so nothing gets rid of it, you see. But when the good plants in the bed flourish, they shade out the wiregrass. Yesterday, we harvested, we pulled a whole bed of green beans. Now, these green beans, there were 2 rows of them in the 4-foot wide bed, and they were lush, and they had lots of leaves, and they flourished, and they produced lots of green beans. And so when we pulled the green beans, there was a little bit of wiregrass left, but all of the wiregrass was thin and spindly because it didn't have a lot of sunlight and it didn't have a lot of ability to flourish. The green beans, the good in that bed, shaded it out. Good can overcome evil, and does in our world. You remember when we started the garden 5 years ago, we had lots of bored children who often liked to do what I called vegetable mischief. They liked to throw tomatoes. They liked to throw peppers. They liked to throw anything that was round. They didn't do it because they were bad. They did it because they were bored. And so we engaged them through summer lunch at the garden, through art lessons, through activities, through teaching them about gardening and food and what those vegetables that they were throwing were. And now, 5 years later, we hardly have any problem with that at all. So good does overcome evil in our world. The significant teaching in this parable is that God has patience in dealing with evil and therefore makes room for grace in our lives and in our world. And I don't know about you, but I am grateful that God makes room for grace. I'm grateful every day. Imagine what it would be like if God dealt with evil the moment it appeared. The first time you did something bad, you would be no more. This world would be empty, right? You see why God doesn't want to deal with evil instantly, immediately? It leaves no possibility for grace, for transformation, for change. There's no hope in that. And none of us want God to be a marionette person up there dictating our every move, right? What fun is that? He gave us free will. He loves us. He trusts us to learn and to do the right thing and to become good and to become, as we talk about here all the time, becoming love. In allowing good and evil to coexist, God makes room for grace in our lives and in our world. And as I said before, I'm not deceived here. Weeds do not become wheat. So that's the place at which this parable breaks down in terms of the analogy that Jesus shares. But I think that when the wheat flourishes, the weeds diminish, just like the wiregrass when the good things in the bed are growing well. People can experience the power of transformation in our lives. We grow, we mature, we become. I'm not the same person I was 30 years ago, and neither are you. And Maddie, I know you're not 30. You're not the same person you were 10 years ago. You're not the same person you were 5 years ago. And in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or however many more years we have, we will not be the same person we are today because we grow, we mature, we change, we experience the grace of God in our lives, and that brings transformation. And God allows evil and good to coexist because God cares about transformation. God wants to see life change. God wants to see us become love. Which leads us to a fourth learning from this parable. And that is that it is not our role to judge between good and evil. God is the one who judges. You notice that the workers, when they discover the weeds, they go to the farmer, who is Jesus, and they say, "Do you want us to pull the weeds?" And he says, No. That'll happen at the end, at the harvest, and it'll be under my direction. And for much the same reason, God makes room for grace. He asks us to make room for grace as well. You see, when you and I write someone off, when we deem them evil, we're saying that there is no possibility of transformation in their lives. We're closing the possibility of grace for them. We don't want that for us, and we shouldn't want that for others. We too are called to make room for grace in the lives of others. We must learn to stay in our lane, to allow God to do what is God's to do. And the fifth learning from this parable, I think, is this. In the end, evil is defeated, and good ultimately wins. You can be sure of that. You can trust God. You can make room for grace because we know that it can change the hearts and lives of people, and in the end, good wins. When we allow God to keep his role as judge, we make room for grace and open the possibility to see transformation take place in places that we didn't think it was possible, and in the lives of people who we have written off. Now, I want to be clear that in some cases and in some relationships with some people who have hurt us so badly, who have abused us, who have hurt us beyond, I'm not saying that you have to be in relationship with them. I'm just saying you have to recognize that even those people the grace can come into their lives and transformation can happen with them the possibility of that exists as long as they breathe. And so my question to you this morning is this, brothers and sisters, and then we'll talk back. Won't you make room for grace?